And they say 2024 was the podcast election. You had former and now once again President Trump on Joe Rogan. You had former VP Harris on Call Her Daddy. And today Governor Newsom said, in effect, being a podcast guest is cool, but what's really cool is being a podcast host. And so we are in the This Is Gavin Newsom podcast era, a place where he intends to talk to folks who disagree with him. And in his first episode with Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk, Newsom made some headlines for this take on transgender athletes.
Would you do something like that? Would you say no men in female sports?
Well, I think it's an issue of fairness. I completely agree with you on that. So that's easy to call out, the unfairness of that. There's also a humility and a grace, that these poor people are more likely to commit suicide, have anxiety and depression. And the way that people talk down to vulnerable communities is an issue that I have a hard time with as well. So both things I can hold in my hand.
Well, sometimes it's a message, sometimes it's the man or woman, and sometimes it's the medium. Sometimes it's all three. Let's bring in someone who understands the message. He is the man. It is Steve Kaplan, political messaging expert, adjunct professor at USC School for Journalism. Great to have you back, Steve. Great to see you again.
It's great to be back.
This is good to talk to you, especially on a day like this. We thought about you for this conversation because you and I have had these talks about authenticity, the different ways in which political messaging gets across. And your Governor Gavin Newsom is clearly trying to crack the code with this podcast. What was your first take when you heard about it announced and then also you saw it play out today?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the questions I get more than any in the last month since the election. How do Democrats compete? How do they get on these platforms and do what Republicans have been doing successfully? So when I heard it, that he was doing it, I wasn't particularly surprised.
Right.
I was wondering if it would be a success. We have the first episode in the can, and we can talk about that a little bit. But I think it's tough. Look, he's getting a lot of earned media coverage right now from his first podcast. That's probably a win. But in terms of the content, I'm not sure that people are going to be waking up in the morning to tune into Governor Newsom on a podcast.
Well,
in all respect.
Not all the coverage positive. Right. President Trump has proven that that's fine as long as it's earned media. You can spin it, and I'm sure Governor Newsom's thinking about that because he makes what some folks see as somewhat of a pivot or at least a differentiation between himself and a lot of the Democratic orthodoxy around, for instance, trans women in women's sports. Before we get into those issues, though, let's just talk about podcasting for a second, because as we say, 2024, huge podcast. You and I talked about this during the election as well. One of the ways in which people can demonstrate authenticity. I feel like demonstrating authenticity is also already performative. Already, you're impugning yourself. You're no longer authentic, right?
Yeah, I think it's a tough balance. Look, Joe Rogan is successful because he's authentic and he is who he is and is able to pull that off. I think to replicate that, particularly for an established, entrenched Democratic governor, is a difficult task. It's not impossible. We've seen this before, though. We've seen in the case of Governor Newsom bringing in folks from the other side of the table, really from the other side of the table. In this case, Charlie Kirk. Pretty controversial first guest. It's been tried before in politics. It's not always wildly successful. I go far back enough that Bill Clinton called out a hip-hop artist who's probably way in the archive, Sister Souljah. Yeah. He had that moment. The concept was to try and push back against the orthodoxy. It was a moment that was meaningful and memorable. Maybe it needs to be said to folks within the party, as opposed to embracing somebody who's really, quite frankly, been pretty disparaging, more than disparaging, of LGBTQ people and others in Charlie Kirk. So I think that's an interesting choice of a first guest, but he got a lot of media attention, and that may be what he's going for.
He did. And Governor Newsom, let's just say this: it's a big swing, right? And so when you make a big swing, you're going to take some heat, you're going to take some criticism. So in defense of Governor Newsom, he's trying something, right? And whether we're talking about trying to be authentic or not, whatever that conversation is, he's saying, I'm just trying to meet people where they are with this medium, and also meet people where they are if they're on the other side of the aisle. So I suppose you talk about Charlie Kirk as a guest, but talk about the initiative, because Democrats are saying this is probably going to upset us a lot because along the way you're going to have someone who doesn't agree with Democrats saying things, and is Governor Newsom going to rebut every single thing? And in this case, he didn't.
Right. Look, I think that we're at a place where we need to acknowledge that people have wildly different views in this country, and to get people around a table and acknowledge those things is always a good thing. The notion of whether a podcast is the right format, I'm looking at more from a media strategy standpoint. Yes, in this moment, it's relevant. Will it be 6 months from now? Will it be a year from now? Will it be in 2028? One thing I can tell you, in the last year, we talked a lot about TikTok. Will TikTok be relevant next year? We don't know. Same with Meta, same with podcasts. The media environment is incredibly fluid. So I think Democrats need to find new and next-gen kind of tools to talk, and podcasts is perfectly good. But it's a little bit of a saturated market, and that would be my concern from a media standpoint.
That makes a lot of sense. We've seen a lot of big companies like Spotify pull back on these billion-dollar investments in the podcast economy, though Joe Rogan still gets that kind of money because, as you say, he's native to the form, and therefore he gets a pass in lots of ways and is authentic because he is podcast in a lot of ways. You talked about trying to iterate and for the next generation, but on this podcast, they were still litigating some aspects of the election, not surprisingly, including an ad that you and I talked about. I want to play that for the folks at home, and we'll talk about it on the other side. Let's take a listen.
But the most effective ad of this election cycle, the most effective ad, you know what it is.
Yeah, and devastating. Trump's for you, she's for they, them.
And
devastating.
Again,
devastating.
Devastating. And,
devastating.
But let's talk
and
about,
she didn't even react to it, which was even more
and let's talk about why it was,
and then you had the video that it was a validator. Brutal.
Yeah, and so
tens of millions of brutal, and then the targeted focus from the Trump campaign, next level.
And then Charlemagne comes out on Breakfast Club, is like, this is insane, and they ran it on NFL football.
Brilliant.
Are they wrong?
No, they're not wrong. It was a very effective ad, and we talked about that. You know, for the first part of the campaign, Donald Trump talked a lot about the economy, about immigration, almost entirely. And when they struck that chord on she, he, them, they really knew that they struck something that was powerful. Now, discussing that and litigating it, if I want to use that word, with Charlie Kirk, and watching that, it's not that Governor Newsom's wrong. They needed a stronger response, but whether that's the right platform or not for him to sort of, it felt like he was almost the one being interviewed in that moment, and that's an unusual thing. And again, I don't want to pick on the governor. I think it's great that he's trying, but I'm not sure that that was the hit that they needed.
Right. It's interesting because he's taking notes. So he may be listening to this very conversation because he's trying to see what's working and what's not with respect to this first episode. More episodes will be coming, Steve, and your person understands as well. So we just have a moment left. But I suppose we just think about this episode and maybe the enterprise moving forward for Governor Newsom. Who is it for? So a lot of Democrats seem a little upset. Are Republicans watching that and saying, we like that he agrees that that was a good ad? Are they seeing him debate Charlie Kirk and saying, we like that, we don't like that? I mean,
yeah, look, there are real opportunities for Democrats to reach out and embrace some messages that may be considered populist. The economy right now is what matters. Any moment that Democrats aren't talking about the economy is a missed opportunity. We saw that in the State of the Union speech, in my opinion. And I'm not here to beat up on my fellow Democrats. I'm a Democrat, and I'll say that transparently. But that issue is not, relitigating that issue is not a path forward to victory. It may be a way to carve an audience of supporters for 2028, but in this moment, I think the Democrats would do a lot better talking to disaffected people who are upset about the economy and who are looking for lower prices at the grocery store and better paying jobs. And that's really the focus that most Democrats, I think, should be looking at right now.
We talked about the election as a price of eggs election, and guess what? Price of eggs. It's also price of eggs administration, as we heard at the State of
They wanted the
Joint
They
Address.
wanted cheaper eggs.
Yeah, and they haven't got them yet.
They haven't got
so it's going to be very interesting. That avian flu is a big part of it. It's so great to talk to you about this stuff. Thanks for coming in, and more to come.
Have me anytime.
All right, Steve, thank you so much
Thank
for being here. Really appreciate your expertise. Steve Kaplan obviously understands messaging well, and this conversation on podcasting and how people can perform authenticity or just be authentic. It's a multiple choice. You get to choose A or B. We'll be right back.